January 27th, 1986. Night. A conference room in Utah. A group of engineers are on a phone call with NASA. They're not discussing the launch. They're begging NASA to cancel it. They have the data in front of them. They have the temperature forecast. And they know, not suspect, know, that if the Space Shuttle Challenger launches tomorrow morning in freezing weather, it's going to explode. Bob Ebeling, one of the senior engineers, goes home that night and tells his wife, it's going to blow up. But on the other end of that call at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, NASA managers are under enormous pressure. They've had delay after delay. There's a school teacher on board, Krista McAuliffe, who's supposed to teach a lesson from space. Millions of kids are waiting. The president is planning to mention it in the State of the Union address. NASA doesn't want to hear about engineering concerns. They want a launch. So someone at Morton Thiokol, the contractor who built the rocket boosters, does something that will haunt American spaceflight forever. They press mute. The engineers are still talking, still warning, still showing charts, but NASA can't hear them anymore. The managers at Thiokol have a private conversation off the line, and then a senior vice president looks directly at the vice president of engineering and says, "Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat." They unmute the phone. They give NASA the go-ahead. And in that room in Utah, the engineers sit back in their chairs. Some of them are crying. They know what they've just done. They know they're watching a countdown to a funeral. I'm James Tudor. This is the file on the 73-second silence. To understand why those engineers were so terrified, you need to understand one small piece of hardware: the O-ring. The Space Shuttle was launched using two massive solid rocket boosters, those white cylinders strapped to the sides of the orange fuel tank. Each booster was over 100 feet tall, filled with burning rocket propellant. They generated most of the thrust to get the shuttle off the ground. But here's the problem. Those boosters weren't built as one solid piece. They were assembled in segments, stacked on top of each other like a tower of metal drums. And between each segment, there was a joint. To seal that joint and keep the superheated gases from escaping, they used two rubber rings, O-rings. If those rings failed, burning rocket fuel, hotter than a blowtorch, would escape through the gap, hit the main fuel tank, and the entire shuttle would vaporize in seconds. The engineers at Morton Thiokol had known for years that the O-rings had a critical weakness. They didn't perform well in the cold. When rubber gets cold, it stiffens. It loses elasticity. If the joint flexed even slightly during ignition, cold rubber wouldn't snap back fast enough to seal the gap. They'd written memos. They'd flagged it internally as Criticality 1, NASA's own designation, meaning failure results in loss of vehicle and crew. But NASA management had seen minor O-ring erosion on previous flights, and nothing catastrophic had happened. So they kept flying. It's a psychological phenomenon called normalization of deviance. You see a problem, nothing explodes, so you assume it's not really a problem. You get comfortable with risk. And on the morning of January 28th, that comfort was about to kill 7 people. Florida isn't supposed to freeze, but the night before the launch, a freak cold front slammed into Cape Canaveral. By morning, the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The launch pad was covered in icicles. Water pipes had frozen solid. It looked like something out of Antarctica, not Florida. The engineers in Utah saw the forecast and immediately did the math. At 18 degrees, the O-rings would be as hard as hockey pucks. They'd calculated that the rings needed to be at least 53 degrees to function properly. This wasn't borderline. This wasn't a gray area. It was 35 degrees below the minimum safe temperature. They called NASA. They said, "Do not launch." But NASA was out of patience. Lawrence Malloy, one of the program managers, exploded on the call. His exact words, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch?" "Next April." He wasn't asking for data. He was demanding that the contractor prove the shuttle would fail, rather than prove it was safe to fly. He'd flipped the burden of proof. And in engineering, that's how people die. And that's when the managers at Thiokol pressed mute. They huddled offline, and they made a decision that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with fear. Fear of losing their contract, fear of looking difficult, fear of saying no to NASA. They overruled their own engineers. They signed off on the launch. Bob Ebeling went to work the next morning and prayed out loud in his car, "God, please let me be wrong." 11:38 a.m. Challenger lifted off. On the ground, families cheered. Krista McAuliffe's students were watching from their classrooms, excited to see their teacher go to space. The world was watching. In Utah, the engineers couldn't look at the screen. Bob Ebeling watched through his fingers. At 0.6 seconds after ignition, a puff of black smoke appeared from the bottom of the right booster. The O-ring had failed immediately. But then, by sheer accident, a piece of burning aluminum oxide formed a temporary plug over the hole. A patch made of molten metal and luck. For 58 seconds, the shuttle flew on that patch. Then the vehicle hit max Q, maximum aerodynamic pressure, the most violent part of the ascent. Wind shear hit the shuttle hard. The booster flexed. The temporary seal broke. A jet of flame, hotter than the surface of the sun, escaped from the joint. It cut directly into the massive orange external tank, filled with 500,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and oxygen. At 73 seconds, pilot Mike Smith saw something. The last words on the cockpit voice recorder, "Uh-oh." The shuttle didn't explode in a fireball. It disintegrated. The aerodynamic forces tore it apart at 46,000 feet. The country was in shock. President Reagan formed a commission to investigate. NASA's initial response was damage control. They talked about weather anomalies, unpredictable variables. They made it sound like an act of God. But one person on that commission wasn't interested in spin. Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize-winning physicist. He had no patience for bureaucracy, and even less for bullshit. Feynman went around the official channels. He talked directly to the engineers, and they told him everything. The O-rings, the temperature, the muted phone call. During a televised hearing, in the middle of some NASA official droning on about procedures, Feynman pulled a small piece of O-ring rubber out of his pocket. He clamped it in a C-clamp to compress it. Then, in front of the cameras, he dropped it into his glass of ice water. He let it sit. A few minutes passed. Then he pulled it out, released the clamp, and held it up. The rubber stayed compressed. It didn't spring back. It just sat there useless. He looked straight at the camera and said, "For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations. Nature cannot be fooled." It was over. NASA couldn't spin their way out of physics. The engineers were right. The managers were wrong. So who went to jail? Nobody. Who lost their job? Nobody, really. NASA restructured. The managers were quietly moved to other roles. Some retired with full pensions. There were no criminal charges. No one was held personally accountable for ignoring a room full of engineers begging them to stop. Bob Ebeling, the man who tried to stop the launch, lived with crushing guilt for 30 years. On the 30th anniversary of the disaster, just before he died, he gave an interview to NPR. He said, "I think that was one of the mistakes God made. He shouldn't have picked me for the job." He spent 3 decades thinking he failed, thinking it was his fault. But he wasn't the one who pressed mute. He wasn't the one who told engineers to stop thinking like engineers. He did everything right. The villain of this story isn't a person. It's a culture. A culture that treated engineering warnings like negotiating points, that believed you could compromise with physics if the schedule was tight enough. 7 people died because someone decided that meeting a deadline was more important than listening to the people who built the machine. I'm James Tudor. This is Empire Archives. Subscribe.